Now I always like to grow my tomatoes cool, and I'll explain that to you later. But before we do that, we're going to transplant these, which is an important job. And you can see down here we've got tomatoes in all kinds of different stages of growth. Some are ready to go into the polytunnel, so we're going to spend the next 10 minutes talking about tomatoes. Now, why do I grow them cold? There's a very important reason for this, and a lot of people grow tomatoes too hot. I mean, they need about 14 to 16 degrees to germinate, and then I tend to let them cool down a bit. And I know it takes longer for them to grow, but importantly they have less fungal infections. They don't get damping off when the temperature is cold. Now the other thing is that if they damp off, if they get a fungal infection, then you might not notice it at this particular point, but later on when the plant is mature and producing tomatoes, they are weakened. Their immune systems aren't brilliant at this point, and once they've got fungus inside of them, they can then succumb many months down the line. So I like to grow my tomatoes cold. Now I don't know if you can see this, but on these rather leggy tomatoes, I've got, and all of the tomatoes are Alicante, by the way. That's what we've been growing this year. The whole lot is just going to be Alicante. And we've got some true leaves, and we still have here some cotyledon leaves. But I've grown them in modules. So I've got to do a little bit of jiggery pokery with this lot, but I'm going to transplant 1, 2, 3, 4 plants. Now when you are transplanting modules, first of all you need a good stick to give you a jolly good hole in your receiving pot. Tomatoes are one of those plants that grow just to the size of their container and kind of die off when they don't get into a new one. So that's why old-fashioned gardeners would go from a seed tray with no modules, pricked out into small 3-inch pots, then into 5-inch pots, then into 8-inch pots, and then into their final growing position. And we don't quite do it the same these days, simply because modules are really good and they're quite useful. So I've made a decent sized hole in here, and before I transplant them I'm going to give them some water, and the reason for that is so that there is plenty of moisture around the root hairs, and that will allow the compost in here to stick that little bit better. And I'm going to take this plant out because I don't want him confusing matters. Very simple. All that you do is you push from the bottom and out comes the compost with the root ball, and it goes holding only the leaf into the hole that we've made. Now, firming well in, I'm now going to give that quite a drink. And notice I'm not pouring water all over the leaves. I'm being very careful with the water. I really don't want to have fungal infections. These are going to go onto the windowsill, and then they'll stay at about 14 to 15 degrees. A couple of weeks later they'll have doubled in size. Now, when they go outside, there's all kinds of ways of growing tomatoes. You can choose a big bag of compost known as a grow bag. Everybody knows those, and you cut a hole in the grow bag and you're supposed to be able to put 3 tomatoes into one grow bag. Personally, I'm not particularly enamoured of grow bags. You can use an ordinary large pot, a 12-inch pot, and that's cool. The tomato will grow very nicely in there, but you have to water inside the pot, and I much prefer to keep the humidity down around the plant to water outside the pot. And so I'm going to use some of these really neat pots that I've just found called ring culture pots. I normally just cut the bottom of a pot and allow the roots to grow into the compost, but these look like a really neat solution. Now, these are pretty snazzy modern ring culture pots. I just want to show you how they work. They come in sets of 3. So there are 3 pots. And it looks fairly complicated, but it's actually simple. The hole in the centre is where you put your tomato. So the hole is filled with compost and the tomato goes in there, and that's fairly straightforward. Around the central hole there's a reservoir, and on it there are lots of spikes, and you can then, if you want to, push this down into a grow bag, or you can push this down embedded in the soil. That's what we're going to do with this one. Very, very simply, the plant goes in the middle and you water and feed down the trough on the outside. And fundamentally what it does is two things. First thing it does is that if you put some eggshells in the bottom, once the slugs have climbed in there, they don't like the eggshells, so they come back out, so you get fewer slug problems. The second thing, of course, is that this reservoir doesn't splash the plant, so that when you've got a lot of tomatoes in the greenhouse or polytunnel, it's not being splashed every time you water. You just water very carefully into the trough. So it's very simple, very easy, and great fun. Now we've got some plants that are about this size that we're now going to transplant. What's going to happen is this: we'll transplant them into the ring culture pot, and then it will take about, in the polytunnel, 3 weeks to 4 weeks for the plant to have grown so that it gets its first truss. I started these in April, it's now May, so we've done quite well. By the time June comes along, they'll get their first flowering truss. Now a flowering truss is essentially a vine of tomatoes, and you'll see little flowers, 6 or 7 or 9 on a truss all together. When that flowering truss starts to appear, it is then time to start to feed your tomatoes. So you'll be watering at least every week, and then also once a week you'll be feeding. As the weather gets hotter, as June becomes July, July becomes August, you'll be watering more and more, and therefore keeping the plant going, increasing the humidity, unfortunately, so you have to be careful. There's plenty of breeze to blow away fungal spores. The other important thing is that you make sure that these don't ever dry out or ever run out of food. Buy tomato food. I know a lot of people grow their own compost making plants like comfrey, or use manure in a big tea bag, which is actually a pillowcase dipped in water to produce, but I much prefer using the inorganic but very nice tomato fertilizer that you can buy from any supermarket. It's much easier, it's much cleaner, and you get a much more measured dose. I think it was because one day I found a lot of worms in my tea bag that really put me off. They must be fed every week, at least every week. Now by the time your tomato has grown to about 4 foot tall, it's going to have maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe even 5 trusses on it. Now the number of trusses that are on that plant will determine the flavour and the intensity of colour of the tomatoes that you've got going. So I always stop the truss formation when I've got 4 trusses on each plant. Some people go for 5, some people just let them go mad. And you do that by pinching out the very top growing bit. Once you've pinched out that, then nothing else will form. The other thing that we've got to be careful of are side shoots. Whenever one of these types of leaves come off the main stem, you'll get a little bud that will grow out and produce another stem. That's called a side shoot. Always take out those side shoots, otherwise your plant is producing loads and loads and loads of vegetative material and less and less and less in the way of fruit. The other thing about removing side shoots is it increases the ventilation around your plant. When the plant's coming to ripening stage, so we're in the height of August, even coming into September, I remove all of the leaves, leaving nothing but fruit on the vine. That allows the plants to senesce, get old and die, but it encourages the formation of nice, bright red, lovely tomatoes. Tomatoes are easy to grow. There's nothing more wonderful than having your own. So let's go over to the polytunnel, and we're going to plant 6 or 7 of these. I have lightproof matting in this new polytunnel, and these are the first plants to go inside here, so that's really cool. And thankfully the square in the matting just is enough space for one of our in-culture pots, which is quite cool. Now I'm going to chop this soil up quite a bit, simply because I want the roots to get through there nice and easily. And then on goes the pot, and it really is as simple as that. And a bit of loose soil can go back inside, and then in with the compost on the outside. Now I'm always being asked how to get something out of a pot, and it's really quite simple. It takes confidence, that's all. Here's our tomato plant. Put your fingers over the top of the plant like that and wiggle the pot so the compost is loosened. Turn it upside down and it should, quite simply, fall away. And then in goes the whole plant into our in-culture pot, and then we're going to support it up with more compost. Now I know these plants are small, but they're perfectly formed. And then, having got the whole plant bedded in nicely, we can water down the outside of the in-culture pot in the reservoir. Job done. It's as simple as that. You'll notice that I've got lots of space between these. That's partly because lots of people are going to be walking in and around here, but it's also partly to keep down the humidity in the height of the summer in this polytunnel. From the top we're going to have crop bars attached to our uprights so that we can then put canes or strings, depending on how we want to do it, from the top of the polytunnel to allow these plants to grow up. For me, there's nothing more exciting than planting tomatoes because, well, I just love tomatoes.